I've written and said plenty about the problem of hurry in our lives and in our world. There's a condition called hurry sickness, which is the feeling of always being rushed as though you were lagging behind in some race. This raises our stress levels, and we have a sense that we just don't have enough time for everything we have to do, and that is a sign of hurry sickness. We can end up feeling increasing frustration with anyone or anything that gets in the way of what we have to do. And then multitasking is one of our strategies to somehow boost productivity, at least in the short term. But the long-term costs can be pretty high for our present hurry. In this episode and a couple of future ones this season, I'm going to talk about core drivers of hurry that I've been addressing in my own life since I wrote An Unhurried Life. And today, in the spirit of my new book, A Non-Anxious Life, I'll unpack how anxiety drives hurry in our lives. Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. Did you know that you could join a community of listeners to this podcast who are hungry to grow deeper in the unhurried way of Jesus? There's nothing quite like having a group of like-minded friends with whom to share the journey. We call this group Unhurried Leaders, and in 2024, we are going through my new book, A Non-Anxious Life, in a monthly live Zoom to talk about how to live in the unhurried way of God's peace. We have 4 years of archived monthly recordings that can resource your spiritual journey. I'd love to have you join this growing online community of men and women. It's one of my most encouraging hours every month. To learn more and to join this group, please visit unhurriedliving.com/unhurriedleaders. That's unhurriedliving.com/unhurriedleaders. That's all one word. Welcome to the podcast. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you won't miss an episode. And we'd love if you'd talk about this podcast with your friends and colleagues. In my own journey of recovery from a hurried soul, it continues to be important for me to identify what drives my hurry. There are many things that do. I wrote A Non-Anxious Life in part to explore the ways that anxiety continues to be a driver of my own hurry. There is a variety of anxiety that I see in the lives of even Christian leaders that can be a major motor of what they do and how they do it. Now, sometimes anxiety paralyzes us. That's the freeze variety. Sometimes it diverts us. That's the flight variety. But sometimes it can drive us and rush us. And that's the fight variety of anxiety. I've found myself working hard at something, not moved by the holy energy of hope or of joy or of love, but rather because I'm worried about feeling important or valuable or productive. I know I've said things like this before on the podcast. Maybe I just need to say these things again for my own benefit. There is, in fact, immense value in simple reminders. In fact, in his second letter, Peter the Apostle says, I will always remind you of these things, even though you know them and are firmly established in the truth you now have. He writes a letter to people who are already firmly established in the truth they've received. And even the firmly established still need reminders. One of the great challenges in spiritual growth, in fact, is forgetfulness. I learn something good. I grow in that goodness. But over time, I can forget the goodness of that truth, perhaps even take it for granted, and then I begin to wander a bit. Sometimes what I need most is not some new insight I've never had before, but a simple reminder of something I've already known. It's good when truth is refreshed at the center of our souls. There's a holy simplicity about truth in the end. That's why some say that Spiritual growth moves in the direction of becoming a beginner again. So again, today's reminder is about our anxiety. It's a basic issue in many of our lives. Some of us are more aware of it than others. For some of us, it seems more obvious than it does for others. Over the last decade, I've spoken a lot about the nature of hurry in our lives and in our leadership. More and more, the theme of anxiety has surfaced as a primary driver of hurry. I think it's a great challenge in anyone's leadership. Just this morning, for example, as I've been writing the script for this monologue, I had a Zoom conversation that was both exciting and a little nerve-wracking. I was talking with a person who has been an encourager of my writing, and this person has a lot of influence in the publishing world. I left our conversation encouraged, but also a little anxious. Anxiety has just become a habit for me. And it isn't just provoked at the prospect of something bad. Even good possibilities, good experiences can arouse anxiety in me. As I said in An Unanxious Life, anxiety can become a habit, a kind of autopilot that just feels like an unchangeable part of who I am. Now, let me share a little bit more about my own experience with anxiety as a driver of hurry in my soul and in my work. I'm hoping that something of my journey will be helpful in yours as well. One insight that has been helping me in my struggle with anxiety is that it is a temptation, just like many others. In An Unhurried Life, I wrote a chapter titled Temptation, Unhurried Enough to Resist. The thing is, temptations thrive on hurry. Temptation never recommends that you take your time and give careful thought about its suggestions. Temptation is all about now. Hurry up and grab what you want. Take control before someone else does. Get busy and prove yourself. Temptation is by nature hurried. Think about the counsel of James when it comes to temptation. He says, "Submit yourselves to God then, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." How does that actually work when it comes to anxiety-driven hurry? Submit yourself to God is the opposite of those sentences of hurry I shared a moment ago. In place of hurry up and grab what you want, we lean into the invitation of the last few lines of Psalm 27, which say, "Wait for the Lord, be strong, and take heart, and wait for the Lord." Living less hurried involves learning to wait on God. There are things over which you and I have absolutely no control. My anxiety has often been an attempt to gain control over what only God can manage. There are actions I can take. There are, in fact, good things I can do. There is good work for me to engage, but none of that requires anxiety. None of it. Listen again to these words from the psalm. Be strong. Take heart. Wait for the Lord. Does that sentence sound more like anxiety or more like peace? Don't you hear the shalom that undergirds those phrases? Temptation thrives on hurry because if you took your time to reflect on what temptation suggests, you'd say no to it. Temptation is like the advertisement that tells you to buy it now. Maybe you wouldn't buy it if you thought for a minute or two about whether or not you need it. The temptation to anxiety wants to rush you to respond. It wants you to hurry and react. Let's go back to the counsel of James. When we actually resist the temptation to worry, we find that temptation like that doesn't have a great deal of endurance. If we really do offer ourselves to God rather than offering ourselves to ruminating about worry, we find that we resist the impulsiveness of anxiety, and little by little, Christ's peace can displace it at the center of our lives. Sometimes we think we're resisting temptation, at least as far as doing something goes, but we're still perhaps giving it access to our minds and our hearts. Entertaining temptation inwardly energizes it, and it will not be fleeing anytime soon. But redirecting our attention to the God who is with us when we are tempted has a way of diminishing the potency of temptation until it finally gives up, at least for that moment. Even in the case of Jesus, the tempter left him until another opportunity. Another way that anxiety provokes soul hurry is the impulse to control our circumstances or even to try to control other people. We imagine that if we could make people do something or stop doing something, we would no longer find ourselves anxious. We would have protected ourselves from the harm that we fear. But first, controlling circumstances is really beyond us. We may have a little bit of agency when it comes to affecting our circumstances, but so many factors in what happens around us is completely beyond us. As I rose this morning to continue writing this episode, I awoke to strong winds that had blown down a multi-trunk false pear tree that's been in our front yard for decades. What could I do about that? How could I have prevented that? Really, there's nothing I could have done. All kinds of things happen in my life and in yours, in our circumstances, that we are powerless to change. Seeking to control circumstances or other people to manage our anxious feelings, it's a losing game. Our inability to succeed in our attempt is only likely to raise more anxious feelings. The perfectionism that arises from anxiety or the attempt to micromanage everything only amplifies anxiety. A far more fruitful approach to our anxiety, a more unhurried approach, is not to look for outward changes so much as inward ones. It is possible to find an eye at the center of our anxiety storm. Rather than letting anxiety accelerate our thoughts and drive us to a great deal of fruitless efforts, we can abide in the presence of the Prince of Peace here and now, right in the middle of all that swirls around us. This is the strategy that Jesus and his apostles recommend for us in the New Testament writings. As I share all these things, I'm not speaking from some plateau of peace where I never feel nervous or fearful anymore. I still often find myself reacting to unpleasant or unwelcome surprises with anxious thoughts or emotions or physical sensations. These are moments in which I can decide how I'll respond to my inward experiences of anxiety. Will I ruminate or will I pray? Will I frantically try to control my circumstances, or will I find my way into acknowledging God's strong presence that surrounds me in the midst of them? Will I fret, or will I entrust my cares to God with me? Adding anxious commentary or writing an anxious story to accompany my anxious thoughts and feelings doesn't resolve it, but actually increases it. Here's another thing I've noticed when I'm letting anxiety run the show. I tend to jump to conclusions. It's another form of hurry rooted in anxiety. I think I know what's happening, and then I act on those assumptions. I take actions based on a mistake about reality. So, for example, I recently couldn't find my wallet after we'd gone out for dinner. I immediately began to fret about having likely left it at the restaurant. I wondered if I should call them. Maybe I left it in the car. So I took a moment and I went out and I anxiously searched around the driver's seat without any success. I frantically searched everywhere it could have ended up. I even started looking in places around the house where it really couldn't have been, just to do something. Anxiety does that to you. Eventually, you probably won't be surprised to find that I discovered my wallet wedged in the cushion of my familiar recliner, having fallen out of my side jacket pocket. It really was the most obvious place, but anxiety had driven me on a fruitless search. My anxious reactions to unpleasant circumstances do not lead me to wise action. My creative and reasonable thinking capacity often gets bypassed when I let myself be anxiety reactive. But if I take just a moment to pay attention to God in the midst of an unpleasant surprise, it often doesn't take long for me to respond from a sense of God's peace that superintends rather than an anxiety that overrides. As I said in A Non-Anxious Life, anxiety is not a wonderful counselor. It's been wrong so often that I'd do better to see it as more of a false prophet. I really don't want anxiety defining reality for me. Jesus does that so much better. How has anxiety fueled patterns of hurry in your own life? When have you listened to the advice of anxiety and found yourself in a frantic and reactive mode? How much do you slow down, even for a moment, when anxiety rises up, and offer yourself to the God of peace who is always present? I'm learning that peace really can displace worry at the center of my life. I'm learning that peace is more productive than anxiety. I'm continuing to learn how to live my life and do my work in the faithful presence of a Prince of Peace. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.